Hey everybody, how's it going? So, now on the sixth installment of my deep dive album series looking at the Beatles' Capitol albums. And I have to tell you, this is the episode that I was looking forward to the least because the album we're talking about today is the Early Beatles, and there could not be a more complicated story how this album got finally pressed on the Capitol label. I'm going to do my best to try and sort through this entire mess. I am by no means an expert. I can't guarantee every single detail is going to be accurate, but I'm going to try and summarize it as best that I can. So we're talking about the Early Beatles. Early Beatles came out in March of 1965. The material, which ended up on the Early Beatles, was recorded in 1962, late 1962. So we're talking about basically a 3-year span before this album had a legitimate release on Capitol Records. So how did it come to that point? So the Beatles' first album was Please Please Me. This was released in the UK in early 1963. Now, Transglobal was a company that EMI, the parent company of Parlophone Records, contracted with EMI to distribute the Beatles albums globally. And so in the US, they approached a number of different record companies and said, hey, we have this album by the Beatles. Are you interested? Many of the labels, including Capitol, said no. They're from the UK. We don't sell British albums. British albums are not big sellers over here. We will pass. And of course, nobody knew at the time who the Beatles were. They had a #1 hit in the UK, which meant nothing in America. It was like, great, you do your thing over there. We'll do our thing over here. So Transglobal had exhausted every record company, and finally, a tiny little label called Vee-Jay Records held up their hand and said, sure, we'll take it. And so they were given the rights to the Please Please Me album, and they fully intended to release it as Please Please Me. However, they knew that Please Please Me had gone to #1 in England, so they intended to release it, and they did release it as a single with Ask Me Why on the flip side. So having taken Please Please Me off of here as a single, they didn't want to duplicate it and also put it on the album. So they knew, okay, we're going to have to change the name of the album. We're going to have to change the cover artwork. And so they came up with Introducing the Beatles. And they had a photograph which was sent to them, which, as I mentioned before, the photograph was flipped. This is actually a reverse image. And it's also kind of very cute that they call them England's #1 vocal group, because back then, hard rocking group, that was not very impressive. So apparently they thought, well, if they're going to be here in America, they're going to be competing with another vocal rock and roll group, the Beach Boys. So let's call them a vocal group and maybe they'll make some noise over here. And there's been some debate. Did this album come out in 1963 or did it not? The jury is still out. There are books that said, yes, this was released in 1963. This was the Beatles' very first release in America. And there are other sources that say, no, it did not. One of the things that you need to know is the label head for Vee-Jay Records was a degenerate gambler. And basically, he sunk Vee-Jay Records into enormous debt. So even though they had all the record label or the covers printed, the labels printed, the story goes they didn't actually get around to releasing it because they were having cash flow problems. Well, come this late December, early January 1964, I Want to Hold Your Hand gets released in the United States, and it explodes. All of a sudden, Vee-Jay Records is like, who's that single by? The Beatles. It sounds very familiar. What? Oh. We have the rights to a Beatles album. All of a sudden, they're scrambling like, oh shit. We've been sitting on this album all this time. We got to get this baby out. In the meantime, Capitol is already preparing the Meet the Beatles album. So there is like this rush. Who's going to get a Beatle album out first? Introducing the Beatles did not even have a back cover. They'd had the cover art printed. They didn't have any idea what the back cover was going to look like. So the initial covers that went out, the back cover was just other albums that are available on Vee-Jay Records as they were scrambling to produce a back cover for this album. So there are actually albums that exist. They are very rare that have that back cover on them. If you find one of them at a yard sale, if you're Josh, you find it at Savers, snatch it up because it is worth a boatload of money. The second cover, or the second pressing of this record, had no back cover at all. It was completely white. Also very, very rare. If you find that cover, grab it no matter what the price. The third cover was pretty plain. But by this time, Capitol had Meet the Beatles come out, introducing the Beatles, hit the market, and Capitol initiated some lawsuits against Vee-Jay Records because they wanted to be the exclusive album label for Beatle Records in America. And they fought together in a lawsuit. Ultimately, the judge decided, okay, Vee-Jay, your contract, your license for this material ends in October of 1964. You are allowed to release whatever versions of this material you want up until October of 1964. Then it's cease and desist, and that license for this material reverts to Capitol Records. So, what did Vee-Jay do knowing, okay, we have money problems, we have a limited amount of time to get this material out to market, so they released this album. And much like Capitol Records, they saw the Beatles as a big cash cow, and they decide, okay, we're going to try to repackage this album as many ways as we can. So you saw ridiculous releases like this. This is the Introducing the Beatles album. However, the sleeve itself says Songs, Pictures, and Stories of the Fabulous Beatles. And it has a 3/4 gatefold, pretty handsome package. However, quality control being what it is at a small label, you've got Ringo Starr. You've got Paul McCartney, Paul. You've got Paul again. George, that's right. They have two pictures of Paul McCartney side by side here, and they're calling this one George. And then you've got John. They couldn't even be bothered to change the label of this record to Songs, Pictures, and Stories of the Fabulous Beatles. It says Introducing the Beatles on the label of this freaking record. And not only that, they released this album at least 2 other times. The next time they released it was a double album, and it was called The Beatles versus the Four Seasons. The Four Seasons were also at one time distributed by Vee-Jay Records. Essentially, the Please Please Me album and a Four Seasons record packaged together. If you find that one, grab it. It is selling for upwards of $500 online. Very rare album to find. If you see it, get it. Now, another album, Frank Oetfield, Jolly What, Frank Oetfield and the Beatles. Again, not the entire Introducing the Beatles album, but it's got about 6 Beatles songs, 6 Frank Oetfield songs. Frank Oetfield was a UK comedian who was on Vee-Jay Records, so they packaged that piece together. So Vee-Jay, after October 1964, the party was over. They could no longer release Beatle albums. Well, strangely, there still appeared albums on the market which were Introducing the Beatles. Now, if you see a Beatles album, Introducing the Beatles, and there's no shadow here, I'm going to show you just for comparison's sake. If you can see here, there's a shadow here. where George is standing. There's no shadow here. This is a counterfeit. This is, for all intents and purposes, a bootleg album. It is not legitimate. Another way you can tell is by the label. Introducing the Beatles. If the Beatles is printed below the spindle hole, it's a fake. So a little rule of thumb I like to take is, if the Beatles is above, you're in love. If it's below, oh no, it's a fake. And I know it's childish, and I know it's a little silly, but I'm telling you, when you're out looking for records, remember that little rhyme, and you'll know whether what you're seeing in the bin is real or a fake. So there's a number of counterfeits that flooded the market. There were over 1 million of the legitimate Introducing the Beatles mono copies that went to market. And I think there were fewer than like 400,000 stereo copies. So the stereo copy is, in fact, more valuable than a mono copy. But if you can find both, that's excellent as well. So anyway, Capitol won their lawsuit, and now they're ready to release Early Beatles as of October. Well, there's one problem. They just released the Beatles story. And the Beatles were in the studio putting the finishing touches on the tracks for the Beatles for Sale album, which Capitol would release shortly thereafter as Beatles 65. And Capitol realizing, like, okay, we don't want to totally compromise the sales for the Beatles story or compromise the sales of the album we plan to release as Beatles 65. So we're going to hold off. We're going to pump the brakes a little bit, and we're going to wait until the new year to release these new titles that we have. So in March of 1965, Capitol finally released the Early Beatles, and to their credit, they didn't try to package this as brand new Beatles material. Now, you're not going to hear me give a lot of credit to Capitol Records for the way they butchered the Beatles album, but in this case, at least they were upfront about it. Like, yeah, this is old recordings, the Early Beatles. Now, take a couple points off for the fact that they co-opted the rear cover photograph of Beatles for Sale for the front cover of this album to make it appear as though it's a modern Beatles recording in spite of the title. This cover photograph was taken by Robert Freeman during the same session that was used for the photograph for the cover of Beatles for Sale. So basically, Capitol got lazy, said, we'll take the back cover, we'll slap it on here, and we'll call it a day. And that's basically, this release was kind of an afterthought. It's like, okay, we've still got a bunch of tracks left over from Beatles for Sale. We got 6 tracks left over from Beatles for Sale that we're keeping because we're planning on putting those on a new album very shortly after we release this. So I think a whole lot of care was not put into this. I mean, the back cover, there's barely any liner notes. I mean, you compare this to the liner notes on Meet the Beatles and the liner notes of Beatles 65. It's like, why even bother? And then you've got, these are all the Beatle-related recordings up to date. And this is an 11-track album. And of course, we know Please Please Me had 14 tracks. So where are the 3 other tracks? So I saw her standing there, as we know, ended up on Meet the Beatles. And there were 2 further songs, There's a Place, and I believe it was Misery, which are not on this album. Those would not see release until 1980. Capitol came out with kind of a catch-all. They called it a rarities album. There really wasn't anything that hadn't been heard somewhere in the world before, but they just stuck those 2 tracks. Finally, some 15 years later on this release that they were, Capitol was trying to put out Beatle albums pretty regularly in the late 70s and 80s because the Beatles were still very popular. So anyway, that's where those 2 tracks ended up. So I've got this copy, which is, again, a purple label pressing from the late 70s. I've got this stereo copy, which is on the rainbow label. And I've got this mono copy. Also on the rainbow label, obviously. And then the cassette itself, pretty faithful to what the cover looked like. And also the 8-track tapes use the same whatever, the same design, the same layout as the cassette did. So cassette and 8 tracks, for the most part, look the same. So what do I think of the material on here? You know, it really demonstrates how huge a leap with the Beatles was from Please Please Me. This was recorded, I believe it was like a 12-hour session. The Beatles recorded this entire album in like 12 hours. And to be honest with you, with with Early Beatles, with Please Please Me, with introducing the Beatles, you could put a gun to my head and I would not be able to tell you which order these tracks fell on which given album. Number one, because if you've ever had a gun to your head, it's very stressful. You're wondering, am I going to die? Who is a psycho who this means so much to him that he wants to know the track listing for these different Beatle albums? Like, where did this guy come from? Are there any bullets in the gun? It's a stressful situation, so I don't even want to go there. But nonetheless, what I'm trying to say is it doesn't matter. These tracks were not, the sequencing of them is pretty much irrelevant. I don't mind that Love Me Do opens up this album. I don't mind that Do You Want to Know a Secret is the closing track. They're all interchangeable. It doesn't matter. I enjoy these songs. It's the Beatles' first recorded output. There's a couple of covers on here, which I don't mind. But nonetheless, it is still an enjoyable album. And no matter what incarnation you pick up, whether it's this, whether it's Please Please Me, whether it's this crazy album, of which there are also bootlegs, by the way. If it just says songs and stories, or songs and pictures of the Beatles without the stories, it's counterfeit. So even this album has been counterfeited. Or if you happen across this album, pick them up. They're all worthwhile. So anyway, this video has run a little bit long, but it's a very complicated story. I hope I've told it to the best of my ability. I hope you understand. Hopefully it gives some clarity to what the hell was going on back then. Have a great day and take care.